My name is Meulemeester and I will present SpectrEM, exploiting electromagnetic emanations during transient execution. So over the last 5 years, there have been a lot of different transient execution attacks discovered. So either finding new mechanisms that can be exploited, or looking at new covert channels through which a secret can be extracted. In this presentation, I want to ask the question whether the physical effects of a CPU can be used in the context of a transient execution attack. Or in other words, can transient instructions create physical covert channels? But before I delve into the details of these transient execution attacks and physical covert channels, I will first take a step back and explain the basics. So in this presentation, I will focus on Spectre and Meltdown specifically, and these are the first two transient execution attacks that were discovered. So imagine you have a piece of code like this that contains a bounce check guarding an array access. This prevents some malicious user from providing a very large array index accessing some out-of-bound memory region they were not supposed to be accessing. At least that's the idea on an architecture level. Under the hood, the processor implements various optimization mechanisms, such as speculation and out-of-order execution, that can invalidate this assumption. Because when the processor reaches its branch, it will look at the recent history to determine whether it should predict it taken or not taken. So for instance, when it predicts it's taken, it will start executing these instructions, fetching this memory region, and executing the following instructions. And this works great if the prediction is correct. That means that there is a significant performance improvement as a processor didn't have to wait. But the problem arises when the prediction is incorrect. In that case, an out-of-bound memory region is loaded in and can be used by subsequent instructions. So while these instructions will later on be discarded, these instructions can have an effect on the microarchitectural elements, and this value can be leaked. And a similar thing happens when an instruction raises a fault. So due to out-of-order execution, a fault is only raised when the instruction is retired. But in the meantime, instructions following these faulty instructions may have already started executing and can again leak this value. But not only do these transient instructions affect the microarchitecture, but because they're executed, they also have physical effects. Because any operation performed on a physical CPU will leave behind physical fingerprints. So instructions consume power, they emit electromagnetic waves, and they produce heat. And so attacks that leverage these side effects are called physical attacks. In this presentation, I will focus on the electromagnetic emanations, and this can be measured with electromagnetic probes as shown here. In our paper, we use two different setups. So the first one is a quite elaborate setup consisting of a high accuracy probe on a stepper table that offers you very high spatial accuracy. And the second setup is a much cheaper setup consisting only of a passive probe on fixed stand. And so these probes are connected off-screen to an oscilloscope. The target device we're considering here is the Raspberry Pi 4 Model B, which contains an Arm Cortex-A72 processor, which is a quad-core superscalar out-of-order processor and thus vulnerable to these transient execution attacks. But we cannot simply take an existing EM covert channel and put it in a transient execution attack. So while there do exist many existing EM covert channels, most of them focus on long-range transmissions. And this means that their symbol length is multiple orders of magnitude larger than what we have available in a transient execution attack. For instance, for the Arm Cortex-A72, we have around 60 instructions that we can use in our covert channel. How we measure these 60 instructions, you can find the details in our paper. But so we looked at two new techniques to transmit values through the EM domain, and these are based on instructions with operand-dependent timings and control flow dependencies. So the first one relies on instructions that implement certain optimizations that result in timing differences depending on the value of the operand. And this is, for instance, the case for the unsigned division instruction on the Arm Cortex-A72. And you can see this in the frequency spectrum. For instance, when you divide by 0, you get a frequency peak at 150 megahertz. Sorry. So at a clock frequency of 600 megahertz, this corresponds to 4 clock cycles. Similarly, when you divide by -1, you get a peak at 100 megahertz, or thus 6 clock cycles. And you can use this to encode a bit by simply mapping certain bits to certain operands and then inferring these operands through the frequency spectrum. The second technique relies on control flow dependencies on a secret bit. And here it's not really what's inside the branch that is important, but rather the behavior of the branch predictor. Because depending on whether the branch predictor corrects the nested branch correctly, or thus according to the bit or not, a pipeline flush may be required or not. And the presence of this pipeline flush can again be inferred in the frequency domain. So when a pipeline flush is took place, the clock frequency components will be much larger. And this can again be used to encode a secret bit. And so these two EM covert channels are very lightweight and can thus be used within the transient window that we have available. So here I've listed the general code listings for a Spectre attack. And these are your typical Spectre v1 gadgets with an array bounce check, an array access, and then your covert channel. I will refer to gadgets that use the instructions with operand-dependent timings as instruction gadgets, and the gadgets that use control flow dependencies as control flow gadgets. Now, in our Spectre attack, we do, of course, assume physical access to the CPU, as we need this to measure the EM emanations, but we do not assume code execution. Instead, we trigger and train the gadget through an interface. And this is in a similar way to NetSpectre. So NetSpectre is another Spectre attack that doesn't assume any code execution, but instead triggers and trains gadgets through an interface such as an UDP interface. Now we can use the same EM covert channels in a meltdown attack, again substituting the typically cache covert channel in this attack. And in this case, we assume both physical access as well as code execution. Okay. Now, when we measure the EM emanations, we have to somehow map these to the encoded bit value. And to do this, we first take the window in which the victim is executing the gadgets and transform this to the frequency domain. So this has two reasons. So the first one is that taking the Fourier transform eliminates any misalignments in the time domain. And the second reason is that the leakage is inherently present in the frequency domain, as I showed before. And to map this frequency spectrum to actual bit values, we consider two techniques, so both a clustering technique and a neural network. And the former one has the advantage that it doesn't require any training data, but the neural network has slightly higher accuracy. For more details about these techniques, I will refer to the paper. Because we're dealing with EM covert channels, an important parameter is where we place our probe exactly. And we measured the optimal positions using this stepper table I showed before, which allows us to measure the bit error rate at every position over the IC. And when you do this, you get a plot like this, where darker color corresponds to a lower bit error rate. So you can see that certain regions exhibit more leakage than others, and we use this information to place our probe on the optimal position. Now, of course, this optimal region changes depending on which core the victim is running on, but in our paper we show how you can circumvent this. Also interesting is that this optimal region is slightly different for the two different gadgets, and this is most likely due to the different hardware effects that this gadget exploits. So when you place your probe at the optimal position, you can get very low bit error rates, even when considering only a single trace per bit. So for the instruction gadget, we were able to achieve less than 0.01% bit error rate, and for the control flow gadget, less than 0.8%. And these are, of course, in the most optimal conditions. So we're able to achieve up to 350 bits per second, which is quite a lot higher than NetSpectre, which is another Spectre attack that doesn't assume code execution. But of course, we're operating in a different threat model as we do require physical access, so it's not really easy to compare the two. Regarding countermeasures, these EM covert channels are quite hard to avoid. So this shows that defenses against Spectre should really focus on the source of the attacks rather than the effects that they can have in the microarchitecture, for instance. To show that these gadgets occur in real-world code, we looked at OpenSSH, which is a popular implementation of the SSH protocol. And there we found two control flow gadgets. So this is an example here, where a user provides an ID for a channel. And so here you have the bounce check, the array access, and then the control flow dependency on C here. So this forms a control flow gadget where the leakage here is whether C is 0 or not. For more details about these gadgets and the evaluation that we performed on OpenSSH, I will also refer to the paper in the interest of time. So to conclude, we showed that EM covert channels can be used in the context of transient execution attacks. And please also be sure to check out our artifact, which hosts all our proof of concept implementations and evaluation scripts. And we also make available all our EM traces so that you can play around with these scripts even if you do not have your own EM setup. Thank you.